If you're listening to this just without the video, or maybe you're on a podcast, you just missed a funny video. How many of you are the broccoli guy? Anybody? Yeah? Anybody have broccoli kids like that? Yeah, it's all of you, by the way, right? In fact, a couple of days ago, we tricked our kids into eating mushrooms. That was a good New Year's resolution, so it's awesome. Thanks, my wife, for that. Hey, I'm so excited today. We're starting a brand new conversation called Better. Let me show you the tagline, Better, how to have a better year than the last. Now, we thought about calling this series the conversation resolution, tagline, how to fail in 2 weeks, but we're already really good at that. So we thought about talking about how to make things better. And the thing that I love, and I bet you love about better, is better doesn't have to be sweeping change, right? Better doesn't have to be massive overhaul. It's just like better, like a little bit better. It could be incrementally better. You could just be 1% better today than yesterday, and you can claim that you're better, which is a good thing about better. In fact, it gives us a lot of opportunity to grow and be better. We could probably talk about, really this idea anytime during the year. There's no better time than now to be better, but isn't there something about like the beginning of a new year that just makes us think about being better? It makes us like choose a word of the year or a resolution, make a promise to ourselves, maybe make promises to others, and we just want to be a little bit better. What's kind of cool about this idea is it's not a new idea, like New Year's resolutions or promises. This isn't like a modern kind of thing. In fact, if you go back 4,000 years, you would enter yourself into the Babylonian era, the Babylonian Empire, and the Babylonians actually wanted to make the new year better just like we do. It functioned a little differently. In fact, their calendar was a little different. It kind of started with the spring equinox, so kind of end of March, launched their new year, and they would make promises to one of their gods, the sun god Marduk. You may have heard of him before. Now, Marduk, this is the band Marduk. You may be thinking of them, okay? This is a Swedish heavy metal band. They look awesome. They look really cool. I bet they're really friendly. Here's the sun god Marduk. Okay, this is an actual picture of him. He posed with a pine cone, which is really cool because he's in the Middle East. So pretty awesome. Pine trees over there. This is Marduk, sun god of the Babylonian Empire. And here's what would happen. They would have this 11-day festival that celebrated the rebirth of Marduk every end of March. And what they would do is make promises to Marduk to be better this year than they were last year, because here's what they all thought. They thought that Marduk was against them when they behaved badly, but if they would make promises and be better this year than last year, then Marduk would lean in their direction and send rains and send crops and just make the year a little better. But it hinged on their behavior. It kind of hinged on their ability to make promises and live up to those promises. Now, I don't know how good you have been about going to the gym this year, but if you were doing it for Marduk, you would be more committed probably because, look at that guy. You don't want him after you. And so every year they would make these big promises, 4,000 years ago. Now, fast forward a few years, in fact, almost to the first century, just before the first century, when the Roman Empire really came into being, this idea of New Year resolutions, New Year promises followed them as well. Again, it's been around forever. Of course, the sun god Marduk was out of the picture, and now there was a mythical god named Janus. Janus is where we get the word January from. Janus was thought to have two faces, maybe two heads, facing in opposite directions. He's kind of like Voldemort and Professor Quirrell, if you know who that is, or maybe like your mom who could always see out of the back of her head and knew what you were doing, right? So this is Janus, and the Janus has a kind of a cool story. This mythical god was thought on December the 31st, because their calendar is where we get our calendar from. On December the 31st, they thought that Janus, out of one face, would look into the past and evaluate how they had been living over the last year, and then with his other face, look into the future and evaluate how they could be better. And they would make promises to Janus, just like the Babylonians did to Marduk. They would make promises to Janus that they would be better next year. And as he evaluated their past sins and evaluated how they treated people and how they, loved their enemies and all the different things, how they, behaved, Janus would look into the future, and if they would behave better, he would lean in their direction. He would help them. He would ensure that they had a better year. Now, I don't think any of you are trying to appease the gods, right? When you think about being better, you just want to be a little bit better, right? Like you're not trying to appease Janus, you just want to fit in your jeans. Like, you're not trying to appease any gods right now, probably, right? We don't think God functions that way. But the idea of wanting to be better, again, goes back in antiquity. I mean, we're not alone in this. This idea in January of wanting to be better, live better, like better, love people better, make a resolution, pick a word and stick to it. I mean, there's really nothing new about that. And, the Romans did have one good idea, and it really is the way that Janus kind of functioned, because we function that way as well. When we think about being better, you know what we do? We evaluate our past, and we think about the areas where we weren't better. Maybe that's what you've done this year already. You've looked back at last year and you thought, what are the areas of my life that I wasn't great in? Like, what are the areas of my life that I was just kind of good but not great? And I really think I could be better in. And that's how you defined better for you this year. And that's how you would define how you want to live better. And the good news, I guess, for all of us is that our lives are complex, and our life gives us a lot of opportunity to find an area to be better. As you think about last year, maybe it was a really good year for you. Like maybe last year was a really great year. And if you think about being better, you think, I don't know how this year could be better. Last year was so good. I'm not really sure that this year could be as good as last year. Or maybe you look at last year and it was a really bad year. Like maybe last year was a really tough year. Maybe there was tragedy. Maybe there was things that happened that you didn't choose but were forced upon you. You found yourself living in a space where it just wasn't better. In fact, it was as worse as it could get. Or maybe you found yourself living in a place where you had made some decisions that led to some problems. And the thought of this year being better isn't really much of a stretch, because when you're already at the bottom, being better isn't that much better, but it's still better. Again, there's so many areas of our life that we could apply this to. Most of us are probably somewhere in between that, right? Like last year was okay. There was good parts, there were bad parts, but there were definitely areas where we could be better. Maybe for you this year, it's a financially better year. Like maybe this year you want to figure out a way to make more money, or maybe even better yet, you want to figure out how to spend better money. Not spend more money, you were already really good at that, but maybe this year you want to learn to live within a budget. You want to learn to save more, or maybe learn to give more. Or maybe, we joked earlier, but maybe for you it is a physical thing this year. Like maybe you really do want to become more healthy this year. Like maybe you want to go to the gym 4 times, not 2 times. That's twice as much as last year. That's better, right? Like maybe this time you don't want to just buy the spandex, you want to wear the spandex somewhere. Not to the gym I go to, but somewhere else. Like you should do that, Or maybe it's a relational thing. Like maybe this year, the thing that you could really do to make this year better is to lean into some relationships. Maybe you could spend more time with the people who you really care about and who care about you. Or maybe you could be a real overachiever and be better at loving people who don't really love you and maybe not even really like you. Like maybe you could begin to pray for your enemies, or maybe not even have enemies, right? Or maybe it's a vocational thing. It could be a career thing for you this year. Like maybe you found yourself in a job that you just really don't love. It's sucking the life out of you and there's no joy in it for you, and you're working to find that joy and you know that it's possible, but maybe this is a vocational thing for you. You can be better this year. Or maybe it's a spiritual opportunity. Maybe there's a spiritual way for you to be better. This is kind of great. Everything in our life has a spiritual component to it, right? The physical thing about being better, there's a spiritual element to that. The vocational thing, there's a spiritual element to that. The relational thing, wow, there's a lot of spiritual elements to that. But no matter what area of life you want to be better, it's good to know that better might be possible. In fact, we want to believe that better is possible for sure, right? Like we love the idea that better could be possible for us. In fact, that's kind of what January feels like. It's this fresh new opportunity that we think anything is possible. It's a new year. Maybe better is even possible. Incremental change is possible. And we want to believe that's true, but here's the problem. If we could just stop for a minute. Here's the problem. This is not our first January rodeo, is it? Like this isn't the first year we've had the emotion of wanting to be better. Because you remember last year, don't you? You remember how things went when you made those promises last year? Like, remember you chose a word for the year, you chose patience. And then on January the 2nd, you got to that 4-way stop. You remember you chose peace last year, and then, you remembered you had children? like you had good intentions, right? Like you wanted things to be better, but it was difficult. And you want to believe that better is possible, but you know what? Honestly, making better possible is way harder than just hoping that it's possible. It's easy to hope that better is possible, but turning better into reality, that is a lot harder. In fact, if you've been through enough Januaries before, you may be sitting here going, I don't even think better is possible. For me, better is actually impossible. I just think it's impossible. I've tried to be better so many times, and I'm just not better. Like, it's just not working. Maybe this is just kind of who I am. I'm just not really going to be that much better, you know? Maybe that's why you're here. You heard we were talking about better, and you thought, well, maybe this guy can give me some advice because I am terrible at this. And commitment isn't your problem, right? Like, commitment is not the problem for any of us. Commitment is actually what gets us started when it comes to being better. Like, we're really good at committing to something. We're good at buying the workout clothes. We're good at joining the gym. We're good at even going to like the Whole Foods place and buying a bunch of broccoli. Like, we're good at that part. The commitment isn't the problem. The secret to better is actually consistency. See, commitment kind of gets us started, but it's consistency that keeps us going. Think about it this way. Commitment is kind of like the starting line, but it's consistency over time that allows us to run the entire race and get to the finish line. And that's not like a big secret, right? Like in fact, think about it like this. Like this jar has 365 marbles. Like, each marble could represent one day this year for you, or maybe each marble represents one incremental opportunity to just be 1% better this year. And what we really want to do is take all of this opportunity and pour it into this empty jar, which represents our opportunity to be better this year. Because what we want to do is kind of microwave better, don't we? Like, we want to like even Instapot better, but you can't Instapot better. Like, this is a crock pot game, not an Instapot game. And so the real way to be better is to take one incremental step at a time, you know, one day at a time. And so on January the 2nd, you were a little better, you know, and then the 3rd, you were a little better, and then the next day a little better, and then the next day a little better, and then the next day a little better, and it's been 5 days, and you're like, this isn't that great. Because you don't feel like you're making any progress, do you? You know what we call this? This is a principle. It's actually called the consistency effect of change. And we know this works, right? In fact, none of you are writing this down because you know this works. Like, you know that if you could consistently every day be a little bit better than the last day, that eventually this jar of opportunity, the jar of better, would begin to fill up. But it would take a long time. And we're not really good at taking a long time. This represents a really incredible opportunity, but we don't seem to do well with it because we don't do well with the consistency part of it. In fact, which really kind of begs a question, why do we consistently fail at being consistent? Like, why do we consistently fail at being consistent? I mean, we know that consistency is the secret. Like, we know that if we want to be better this year, we have to consistently over time move the opportunity into the new year. But we always end up failing at this. Why is that? Why is it that we fail at being consistent? I'd like to pose a reason, and I think this is the reason why. The reason that we struggle to be consistent is because when we're trying to make something in our life better, we find an area where we're not already better, maybe we could call it a weakness, and we try to turn that weakness into something better. We try to find an area where we were worse at last year and make it better this year. That's kind of how these things work. But when you're operating out of a weakness, it's really difficult to turn it into better sometimes. For instance, I have never made a New Year's resolution to do something that I'm already good at and be better at it. Never done that. Like, I have never once, thought, you know what, this year, I'm gonna eat more cinnamon rolls this year. Like, that's my goal. More baked goods this year. In fact, this year, every time the hot donut sign is illuminated, I'm pulling in every time. Like, I promise, I don't have to do that. I am so good at doing that already. It's like a spiritual gift for me. I don't even have to try. Like, my car just turns in without any effort, right? It takes no effort for that to happen. And the same is true for you. Like, when you think about making something better in your life, you don't pick something you're already great at. You pick something that you wish you were great at. You pick, if we could say, an area of weakness. And here's what happens. In our strength, we begin to try to be better. And we do move a marble over. And then we do move a marble over. But pretty soon, these little marbles get really heavy. You know why? Because we're weak. We're weak in this area. That's the problem. Now here's something you need to know. The Babylonians and the Romans did have an element of this correct. There's a spiritual piece to this. But what they didn't understand is that they thought that they had to be better for God so that God would be for them. And here's what we know about God. God is already for us. God already wants us to be better. In fact, there's nothing you can do to make God want to be with you more. There's nothing you can do to engage God in your life any more than he already wants to be engaged. Like, he's not watching your behavior going, well, let's see how things go this year and maybe I'll help at some point. Like, that's not how God works. In fact, the Apostle Paul knew that full well. The Apostle Paul, in one of his letters that he was writing, he wrote several letters to the churches in Corinth. We have two of them. In fact, they make up part of our New Testament, 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And in 2nd Corinthians, he writes to the people, the church, the Christians, the Jesus followers in Corinth, and he tells them about something that he's struggling with and how he asked God to intervene and make things better. And the response he got from God is beautiful, but a little mysterious, because it's not what we probably would want God to say back, but it's the absolute perfect thing for God to say back. And I think if we were to write the same letter and ask God the same thing, I think he would say the exact same thing to you and to me. So we're going to pick this story up in 2 Corinthians, and we're going to figure out how God can be a part of this year and how it can be better with him being a part. Now, to understand what Paul was going through, I need to kind of show you what he wrote about the issue he was dealing with. Here kind of is how he starts. So this is in 2 Corinthians 12. He says, so to keep me from becoming proud, I was given a thorn in my flesh. You may have used that term before, like a thorn in your flesh or a thorn in your side or a pain in your side. You know, don't talk about your spouse that way, but you may have used that at some point. You were quoting the Bible. You had no idea. So this came from Paul. He said that God basically had given him, he thought, this thorn in his flesh. And it was pretty significant. He called it a messenger from Satan. That's pretty significant. To torment me and to keep me from becoming proud. This is important. We're going to come back to this in a little bit, but here's the gist of it. And theologians have tried for years to figure out what this thing was that Paul had, and we don't really know. I mean, people have said maybe it was headaches or seizures, or it was suggested when I was younger. I remember hearing people say they thought it was like an eye thing. Whatever it was something that was kind of obvious enough that when Paul showed up and people saw him, they were like, oh, thorn in his flesh. Like it was visible. And it was causing him pain, but also kind of working against what he was trying to do, which caused him to have to rely on God. Maybe that was the point. We'll find out in a minute. So 3 different times, kind of Paul asked God for help. He continues as he writes. So 3 different times, I begged the Lord to take it away. And each time the Lord said, now, if you were in Babylon or if you were in Rome and you kind of prayed to Marduk or you prayed to Janus, please take this away. What do you think those guys would say, I think they'd say this, like, well, just try harder and stop giving up, because for you, better is probably impossible. You stink anyway, right? Like that's kind of how they lived. They thought that we're not good enough on our own. God doesn't love us the way we are. He's not really for us. We're going to try really hard. We're going to be better on our own. And if we can somehow pull that off, maybe God will lean in our direction. Maybe God will help us in some way. That is not what God said. In fact, that's from Second Opinions if you want to look it up later. Okay, so that's actually not a Bible thing. If you don't try to look it up, you'll never find it, okay? Here's what God actually told Paul, and we're going to pause in this minute for a minute. It's really significant. Here's what God told Paul, and here's what he would say to you as well. He says, each time he said, my grace is all that you need. My power works best in weakness. I grew up reading a translation called the NIV, and it says that my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in your weakness. Do you know what this word grace means? Grace is this word that's hard to understand because it doesn't really exist in our world very much. But grace is undeserved favor. It's unmerited love. God is telling Paul that my undeserved, unconditional love and acceptance for you is all that you actually need. You think you need this thing removed from you. You think you need this problem resolved, but my grace is bigger than that problem. My grace is so significant, it overwhelms the issue. My grace covers that. It's all that you really need. Then he says that my power works best. My power works best in weakness, which is a significant thing because when we hear that word power, we tend to kind of skip over it for a minute. We think, okay, yeah, God's powerful, I get that, but hold on. Think about how powerful God is. And when God says, my power is made perfect in your weakness, my power works best in weakness. I mean, we're talking about an incredible power. I mean, beyond anything we've ever really seen in our life. I mean, the power to create the universe, the power to create you. I mean, it's so powerful. God created 350,000 species of beetles. That's powerful. Okay, the power that turned water into wine, the power that separated dark from light, the power that rose people from the dead. Think about this. The very power that allowed Jesus to die and 3 days later come back to life, that very power works best in your weakness. And here's something I just don't think as Jesus followers we really think about enough. That the exact same power that brought Jesus back to life lives in your spirit and lives in your soul. As a Jesus follower, you have access to that. And if you're not a Jesus follower, it's available to you as well through faith. But that is in you. That kind of strength and power is in you, but it's not you. It's the Holy Spirit. It's God in you, which is really significant. And here's what it means. It means that if God is possible, then better is actually possible. That if God's power is actually real, then better is possible. No matter how bad things are, no matter how much better you need things to be, God's grace is sufficient, and his power can be in your weakness. You know, when we hear that, I think that we kind of grow up thinking about God as being this kind of distant thing who probably cares about the real big stuff. Like God probably cares about cancer and death, but he didn't really care about the small stuff, right? I mean, he's busy, right? He's got a lot going on. But that's not who God is. Did you know that God cares deeply about you? Like God cares deeply about every area of your life. God cares so much about you. He cares about everything in your life. He does care about the big stuff, but he cares about the small stuff too. Do you know what God cares about? He cares about everything that you care about. And if there's something in your life that you want to be better, God wants you to be better at it. If there's something in your life you're trying to work through, God wants you to work through it. But he just doesn't want you to do it by yourself. He doesn't want you to try in your own strength to figure it out. He wants to come alongside of you. He wants to allow his strength to be made perfect where you're not strong. He wants his grace to be present in the moments that you need it the most. And that power is in you. It's with you. I just don't think we recognize it enough. In fact, as Paul began to recognize it, he actually began to take joy in the issue that he was struggling with. Look how he kind of concludes the idea. He says, so now I am glad, which who of us would say this, right? Like now I am glad to boast about my weaknesses so that the power of Christ can work through me. He continues, that's why I take pleasure in my weaknesses and the insults and the hardships and the persecutions and the troubles that I suffer for Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong. For when I am weak, then I am strong, which means that we don't really have to rely on our own strength. Which means that as we're trying to make things better, we don't have to rely on our own ability to make them better. That the strength of the Almighty God living and alive in you has the ability to do that for you and the ability to do that with you if we can just grab a hold of it, if we can just allow it, if we can maybe, if I could say, get out of our own way at times. See, the principle is true, right? The consistency effect of change really does work. But when it comes to changing our own life, we don't really have the ability to do it on our own. We're just not strong enough. We don't have what it takes by ourselves. But when we begin to bring the power of God into it, it changes everything. In fact, the consistency effect of change begins to look more like the consistency effect of faith, where we consistently lean into God, where we consistently allow the power of the Holy Spirit to be alive in us and to change us from the inside out. I mean, maybe another way to say it is this way, that rather than consistently working harder on our own weaknesses, we can consistently give your weaknesses to God so his power can be made perfect in your life. That's what Paul came to understand. That's what Paul believed is true. I bet some of you believe that's true as well, because you've experienced that. Because there was a moment in your life where you wanted things to be better. And maybe you even started trying to move those marbles over by yourself, but you realized at some point that you just weren't strong enough. and you allowed God's power to begin to move the marbles for you. And you wondered, is God going to pick it all up and just dump it in? But that isn't real lasting change. But what you found is that when you needed God the most, he picked the marble up and moved it for you. And when you needed him to intervene the most, he intervened and moved the marble again. And every single time there was an opportunity for you to rely on your own strength instead of his, he let you do it. And you struggled to move the marble. And then when you gave it and opened your hand, he moved it again for you. And slowly but surely, you began to realize what Paul realized, that God's power really is made perfect in your weakness. And maybe even more importantly than that, when God's power intervenes in your weakness, you begin to experience God in such a fresh new way. God seems to be super tangible, super present in your life. Do you see people sometimes who walk around and seem to have this connection with God that you don't have, and you wish that you could have that connection? Can I tell you, one of the absolute fastest ways to begin to develop that depth of a connection is to begin to release your hands to God and give your weaknesses to him so his strength can be made perfect in it. Because you'll begin to experience God in the most dynamic ways you could ever imagine. When you look back through that kind of passage that Paul gave us, he actually gives us some real practical steps that we can take to begin to make this a reality in our life. Because, it's kind of a little ethereal, right? Like, lean into God's power. I mean, that's true, but how do you actually do that? Well, Paul actually kind of gave us some clues to do it. There's 3 specific things that we can do. We're calling it just the better plan for this year. And the first one is simply this: to boast, to admit that you have weaknesses. Do you remember in the very beginning how Paul talked about how God gave him something so that he couldn't become proud? Well, pride lives in our lives, in our hearts, when we say, I've got this. I can do this on my own. I don't need anybody to help me, including God. That's what pride causes us to do. And so when we can, in our pride, move away from that and adopt kind of a heart of humility and boast in our weakness, admit that we have issues that we can't deal with on our own, admit that we have weaknesses that we can't overcome on our own, we position ourselves through humility in a place where God can start doing his absolute best work in our lives and in our hearts. So that's the first step, just to, in humility, boast about your weaknesses, admit to yourselves and maybe people around you that there are areas that you're just not strong enough where you need God. And once you do that, it allows you to begin to ask for help. That's what God's grace is all about. The coolest thing about God's grace in this way of thinking is that you don't have to earn God's help. Like, he's not Marduk, he's not Janus. Like, you don't have to prove yourself before he leans in your direction. God has been pursuing you your entire life, but not to pay you back. He's been pursuing you to win you back. And the minute you turn around and ask for help, guess what God does? He says, it's about time. Yes, I'll help you. Thank you for asking. I've been trying to help for years. Gosh, thank you for turning around. That's what God's grace is all about. It's undeserved, but it's always available. And when you begin to ask for help, the coolest thing happens. You begin to experience his strength in your weakness, maybe to a point where you get to accept it daily and experience God daily. Maybe to a place like Paul was, where you begin to even get excited about having weaknesses. You begin to enjoy or take pleasure in the areas of your life where you're weak, because that's where you experience God the most. And experiencing God is the coolest thing that could ever happen for you. Overcoming something that's not a big deal compared to experiencing God. That's why Paul boasted in his weaknesses. He loved having weaknesses because he loved experiencing God. Now, I don't know, maybe you have a better plan for this, and maybe you've kind of figured out a way to persevere on your own strength. Here's what I will tell you. I'm pretty type A. You may have guessed that. I'm pretty disciplined by nature. Like, I have a tendency to be the kind of guy who says, I got this, don't worry about it, I'll take care of it, And there was a good season of my life where I think I treated God that way too. And anytime we turn to God and say, hey, don't worry about it, I got it, you know what God does, right? He says, okay, like, I'm not gonna force myself on you. I'm gonna force my power, my strength on you. If you wanna do it on your own, I'm gonna let you do that. If you wanna close your fist and hold your marble, that's okay, you can do that. But the minute that you open up, I'm gonna be there to help you because my grace is sufficient for you. I spent too much of my life doing that. I spent too much of my life walking around, kind of holding on, telling God, I got it, I got it, I got it. But eventually, things got hard enough that I didn't have it anymore. And eventually, the cracks in the foundation began to squeeze and some stuff started squirting out. And whenever that happens, it's not that great. And I remember turning to God one day and going, okay, God, I don't got this anymore. Like, what do I do? And you know what I found God waiting to do? I found him waiting to go, okay, thank you. Can I please have your marble? Like, will you please allow me to help? And you know what he did? He helped. He helped. And his power began to show itself in my weakness. His power began to be made perfect in my weakness. And in a really weird way, I began to feel a little bit like Paul. I began to almost look forward to opportunities to be better because I knew that was an opportunity to experience God in a fresh new way. And that's not just true for me, and it's not just true for Paul. It's true for every single one of us. See, here's the truth. But better is actually possible when God's power is made perfect. Better is always possible, but it's only guaranteed when we allow God's power to be made perfect in our weakness. So on your way out today, we're actually going to give you a marble. Now, I'm going to ask you to walk around with it close-fisted, at least till you get to your car, but I'd love for you to put it in your pocket or maybe put it somewhere at home, put it in your car somewhere. And here's the hope. I hope every time you see this little marble, you remember that better is possible, but you remember that better is only guaranteed when you allow God's power to be made perfect in your weakness. That when you allow God's power to move the marble from what could be into what should be. And that is possible because better is possible, but only when we get out of the way and allow God's power to be made perfect in our weakness.